Hello, everyone. So glad to be with you today. This is a wonderful event. It's being sponsored by the Spiritual Explorers Project through Unity, and we are welcoming Arun Gandhi, the author of The Gift of Anger. We have a live audience here today, and we have over 200, probably more, watching us live stream online. So hello, everyone out there. We're glad you're with us. This is an event that has been in the planning for several months, and we're so grateful. We're in North Carolina today, and we're grateful to Unity of Blue Ridge and their wonderful minister, Reverend Darlene Strickland, the wonderful team in the back who is filming all of this and making it possible. We're also so grateful to the many volunteers and people back around the country that help facilitate these live stream programs so that you can be in the comfort of your home or wherever you are and tune in and hear these exciting principles as well as life-changing ideas. I met Arun Gandhi over 10 years ago. He's a good friend of mine now. We have a great sense of humor together. We can tease and laugh and joke and have a wonderful experience. I had heard of him for many years. He had spoken many places, and I had always wanted to have him come to Portland, Oregon, where I'm from, and speak in my area. Through a series of events that happened, and we sponsored him at a local university and a high school and a middle school. And those people's lives were transformed by his speaking. We had the opportunity to drive him to the airport, and he said to my husband and I, "Why don't you come to India with me?" And we were honored. We didn't know that as he traveled around the world, he said to everyone, "Why don't you come to India with me?" We said yes, and we were on a tour of about 20 people who met in Mumbai right before New Year's, about 9 years ago now. I had no idea what I was in for. I was not one of those people that ever wanted to go to India, but you say to yourself, if Gandhi asks you to come with me, what would you say? Yes, you would say yes. And I had a life-transforming moment. He's heard me tell this story before. On my second day, we were riding on a bus through Mumbai, and the abject poverty on the streets of Mumbai, as far as the eye could see. I almost feel teary right now visualizing that in my mind. As far as the eye could see, families and elders and young children laying on the street, sleeping, laying out their comforters, putting down their pillows, making sure the children were comfortable and tucked in. It was more than I could absorb. And I remember moving and sitting next to him on the bus and saying, I don't know how to handle this. My mind was saying, don't look, don't look. And my heart said, you have to look. You have to look. So I really didn't know him well at all. I went and sat next to him and I asked the question, how do I handle that? And he said to me, they don't want your pity. They don't want your judgment. All they want is your love and compassion. And from that day forward, throughout that tour, I just kept sending love, and kept looking and looking. And as we were leaving India, I made a commitment to myself and to the work that he's still doing around the planet, to whenever I could, to be where he is, and to make available the teachings of his grandfather, Mahatma Gandhi, as well as all the wonderful work he's done. So, thanks for being here, my friend.
Thank you very much, Victoria.
So I have some questions we're going to be talking about, and we have some questions from our online viewers, as well as questions from the group of people joining us. So I wanted to start by asking you, when grandfather was in South Africa, and he began his nonviolence movement, what was some of the few things he started with, and what was the impetus that made him start?
I think the turning point in his life came about when, as a young man, he wanted to travel from Durban to Johannesburg to attend a court case, and he felt that his qualifications as a English barrister, um, required that he should travel by first class, and so he got a first class train ticket and sat in the coach until a white man came there and saw him and was aghast, and he very rudely told him to get out of the train, and grandfather refused, and so he went and got the police and the railway guard and all of them together picked him up and threw him off the train. And that incident of humiliation that he experienced, that was the point at which he turned, and he, uh, first of all, he was angered by all that hate and prejudice. And then the next stage was he wanted justice, and he started wondering how to get justice without using violence, and that's when the whole thought process took him to the philosophy of nonviolence, and especially when he went and shared this experience with the rest of the Indian community the next day, and all of them, kind of shrugged their shoulders and says, well, if the white man doesn't want you there, don't go there. And just, And so grandfather said, that's not the attitude. You can't just accept things and be calm about it. It's an injustice. And so he, began to think and develop the philosophy of nonviolence.
You use the quote in your book about he saw all of humanity as one family, not separate, that everyone deserved the same treatment and the same opportunities.
Yes, he always felt, and I think that comes from his tradition in the family. His father was known to be a very compassionate person, and he always gave to the poor people and did things for the poor people and so on. So he grew up in a family where there was a lot of compassion, and I think it was that compassion that made him feel that we are all human beings and we are all interconnected and interrelated, and so we need to feel each other's pain as well as joy and participate in that.
So at one point, I know he gathered some people together and he was going to do a protest. And at the same time, the railroad employees were going to strike. And I've always been fascinated at how he resolved that issue. Could you share that with us?
Yes, this happened in 1913, just before he decided to leave South Africa and go back to India permanently. He decided to launch one final campaign against prejudices. And as he always did, he publicized everything, made it known to everybody what he was going to do, where he was going to do, why he was going to do. Everything was laid out and publicized. And after this was printed in all the newspapers, the next day he read in the newspapers that the workers of the railways were going to go on a strike for better working conditions. And when he read that, he realized that this is going to affect the people as well as the government very seriously. And so it would be improper for him to put additional pressure on the government with his campaign. So he decided to withdraw his campaign until the strike was over. So he announced the withdrawal, and when the strike leaders heard about it, they came to him and they said, we are fighting the same enemy, and we strike also is a legitimate nonviolent tool. So why don't we join hands and fight together and strengthen each other? And grandfather said that, first of all, I don't have enemies. I am not fighting an enemy, I am transforming a friend. And second, he says, you have a different agenda, I have a different agenda. You go ahead and do what you have to do, and then I will do what I have to do. And so the strike went on the next day, and typically, like all strikers, came out into the streets and they were shouting very angry slogans, showing their fist and down with the government and all that kind of thing. And so there was so much anger and frustration in the workers that it was easy for the police or the administration to infiltrate their ranks and cause an incident, giving them the justification to use violence and crush them. And that's exactly what happened. Within 4 days, the strike was crushed violently, and they had to go back to work without gaining anything. And then grandfather launched his campaign, and they filled up all the prisons in the city. And then at that point, the Prime Minister, General Smuts, invited grandfather to come over and discuss a settlement. And there, during that discussion, he admitted to grandfather, he said, I could deal with the strikers because there was so much anger and frustration that I could use an incident and crush them. But he said, I don't know how to crush you because you show so much love and compassion towards us that I don't know what to do with you. And I think that was the key there, that in a nonviolent struggle, if you have more love and compassion, you can deal with the situation rather than have all that anger and frustration.
To me, that's the perfect example of one situation ending the way we don't want it, and we're still learning how to shift our energy and how to think differently. And I think that's what this is all about. I've heard you say over and over, we're not transforming anyone else. We're transforming ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And when we transform ourselves, we think differently and we act differently. So there's another story that I've always, growing up as a child, I remember hearing about the Salt March. And what, once again, my words would be an out-of-the-box idea of how to fight the British government. Would you just tell us a little bit about your grandfather and the Salt March and what that meant to India?
Yes. He had reached a point by the 1930s when he felt that something needs to be done to mobilize the people and lead them into a campaign, because there was so much of frustration and anger within the people. So he wanted to channel all that energy and put it into proper action. So for many months he wondered what kind of campaign could he launch that would be meaningful for the poorest in India as well as the richest. So he could mobilize the entire population. And he, one day, just out of the blue, came up with this idea of the Salt March. He said, we'll defy the salt laws of the British government, because the British were taking the raw Indian salt to England and processing it and packaging it and bringing it back to India and selling it for 10 and 15 times the price. And so this was, considered to be an injustice. And he said, well, this is something we can fight over. And when he announced this, that he was going to defy the salt laws, everybody, including his own colleagues in the Congress party, laughed at him and said, "You and plan to bring down the British Empire by defying the salt laws?" And so, they just kind of took it as a um, as a joke and didn't want to participate in it. Even the British officials, when they heard about it, they laughed at it and said, let him go and do his ridiculous thing and not bother about it. So everybody dismissed it, but until grandfather launched the campaign, and the whole country, from the richest to the poorest, got up and got involved with him. He started the march with 79 people. By the second and third day, he had more than 1 million people in the march. And it was just continuously growing. And not only people in the main march that he led, but in every part of the country they had similar marches going on with local people. So the whole country was afire. And that's when the Viceroy, British Viceroy, realized how they had, dismissed this whole idea. And by then, the whole country was afire, and they could do nothing about it.
Always, to me, a story of one simple act,
Yeah.
and how it can move so quickly and be transforming.
He was very good at trying to find something that would appeal to everybody, and he knew exactly when and what to do then.
So your book, The Gift of Anger, is about your relationship with your grandfather, living with him, and the things he taught you. And you had an opportunity, I know, to spend almost every day with him, and he spent devoted time just with you and sharing ideas and giving you exercises and spinning the spinning wheel with you and all these wonderful connections. I love the story around the chapter in your book that says, "Don't be afraid to speak up." The story about your sister and you and being in the ashram. Would you share that?
Yes, this happened just soon after we came from South Africa. The whole family had come and we went to live with him in the Sevagram ashram. And we were all mortified that every morning and evening for lunch and dinner, and we had nothing but boiled pumpkin and dry bread. And after a few days, we all started getting tired of eating the same thing over and over. And but nobody said anything because everybody assumed that this was what grandfather wanted. And so they all quietly suffered the anguish of eating that kind of boiled food. And then my sister, Ela, who was then about 6 years old, she couldn't wait any longer. So she went up to grandfather and she says, I think you need to change the name of this ashram. Sevagram means a service village. And she said, you should call this Kolagram. So he said, why? He said, well, ever since we have come here, we haven't seen much of service, but we see pumpkin being served to us, and the name for pumpkin is kola in Indian language. So she says, we see pumpkin being served every morning and evening, and I'm tired of it, so why don't you just change the name of this place? And that's when grandfather realized what was happening. And so that evening at the prayer meeting, he called the person who was managing the ashram, and he said, I got this complaint from this young lady. Can you explain why are you serving boiled pumpkin every day? And so he said, well, you wanted us to live simply, and so we are eating what we can grow on the grounds here. And grandfather said, well, that simplicity doesn't mean you eat the same thing every day. And secondly, he says, don't tell me that the farm cannot grow anything but pumpkins. And so the man confessed that he made a mistake and he just planted acres and acres of pumpkin and didn't know what to do with all that harvest. So grandfather told him that you better find a way of dealing with this. And so he talked to him about bartering the pumpkin with other vegetables from the village people. And so we started getting better food after that.
Thank goodness for a young mind and someone who was willing to speak up. One of the lessons that you talk about your grandfather teaching you and the depth to which your teenage mind worked on it is the difference between passive and physical violence. And I've heard you speak about it many times, and every time it's like a new little light bulb goes on, and I extend it to another area of my life. I think it's something we don't realize. We just think violence is violence, anger is anger, and it's about those people who commit violence or commit anger, and we don't take accountability. So would you talk a little bit about how he taught you about that physical violence and the passive violence, and how we can take that into our own lives?
Yes, I think I need to explain a little bit about the background to this. Because we subscribe to this violence as the main option that we have in dealing with conflicts, we have created a whole culture of violence. A culture of violence that has steadily seeped into us and has taken over every aspect of our lives. Our language, our entertainment, our sports, our religion, our education, everything has become violent. And this is what, my grandfather was very distressed by. And so one day I was coming back from school, and I had this little pencil in my hand. It was about 3 inches long. And I thought to myself, I deserve a better pencil. This is too small for me to use. And without a second thought, I just threw the pencil away. And that evening when I met grandfather and asked him for a new pencil, instead of giving me one, he subjected me to a lot of questions. He wanted to know how the pencil became small and where did I throw it away and why did I throw it away, and on and on. And I couldn't understand why he was making such a fuss over a little pencil until he told me to go out and look for it. And I said, you must be joking. I said, you don't expect me to look for a little pencil in the dark? He said, oh yes, I do. He has a flashlight. He'd go out and look for the pencil, and I spent about 2 hours searching for it. And when I finally found it and brought it to him, he said, now I want you to sit here and learn 2 very important lessons. The first lesson is that even in the making of a simple thing like a pencil, we use a lot of the world's natural resources. And when we throw them away, we are throwing away the world's natural resources. And that is violence against nature. And the second lesson is that because in an affluent society we can afford to buy all these things in bulk, we overconsume the resources of the world. And because we overconsume them, we are depriving people elsewhere of these resources, and they have to live in poverty. And that is violence against humanity. And that was the first time I realized that all of these little things that we do every day, consciously and unconsciously, it's become so much a part of our life and our culture of violence that we do things without even knowing that this is violence. And then to make me understand this lesson thoroughly, he made me draw a genealogical tree of violence, with just as we do a family tree, with violence as the grandparent and physical violence and passive violence as the two branches. And every day before I went to bed, I had to analyze and examine everything that I had experienced during the day. Things that I may have done to other people or people may have done to me, or things that I may have read about or whatever it was. All of that had to be analyzed and put in their appropriate places. Now, physical violence is something we all understand because it hurts and we see it every day, and it's all the kinds of violence where we use physical force against one another. But passive violence is something that we have never heard about, and so we don't even know about it. And the way he said that I should find out whether this is passive violence or not was to ask myself the simple question: if somebody were to do this to me, would I be hurt by it or would I be helped by it? And if I came to the conclusion that it would hurt me, then that would be passive violence. And when I began to do this introspection, I was amazed that within a few months I was able to fill up a whole wall in my room with acts of passive violence. And passive violence, as I said, is all the kinds of violence that we do to one another where we don't use any physical force, and yet we hurt people. Things like discrimination, oppression, overconsumption, throwing away food, throwing away perfectly good things because we can afford to do that. All of that would be passive violence. And he I kind of lost the trend there, but when I started doing this and examining all my weaknesses, I came to realize how much passive violence I was committing, and then he explained to me the relationship between the two. He said we commit passive violence all the time, every day, consciously and unconsciously, and that generates anger in the victim, and the victim then resorts to physical violence to get justice. So it is passive violence that fuels the fire of physical violence. So logically, if we want to put out that fire of physical violence, we have to cut off the fuel supply. And since the fuel supply comes from each one of us, we have to become the change we wish to see in the world. If we don't change our attitudes and our behavior and our relationships with each other, we will never be able to bring peace in the world. Today we think of peace only in terms of the absence of war or absence of violence. We think that because our nation is not at war with somebody, we are living in peace, or whether if our neighbor, there's no violence in our neighborhoods, that we are living in peace. That's not true at all, because we are committing a lot of passive violence through the culture of violence that we have inherited. We exploit each other. We have created a whole system of exploitation, commercial exploitation, in monetary exploitation, exploitation of people, gender, and race, and all of these kinds of exploitations that we indulge in, all that is passive violence. So we need to look at that, and we need to change all of those things so that then we can really bring peace and harmony in the world. Because peace, according to Gandhi, is not absence of war. It is creating harmony in society. And harmony can be created only when we have good relationships with each other.
Accountability. And when I even begin to think about passive violence, and I invite everyone who's listening today to begin to think about where in my life would I be willing to write down some of those places where I have judged, where I have overlooked, where I have created a battle in my mind. I may not have acted on it, but I created it in my mind. And we know our minds create energy, and then soon we're in a battle with ourselves, with our neighbor, with our spouse, someone else. So in your book you talk about, and I've heard you talk about it in many settings, compassionate capitalism. And the first time I heard that, I was fascinated by it. Compassionate capitalism, what is that? It's either about the money or it's not. And grandfather and you both have used that in ways that I think can teach everyone in this audience and all our listeners about how we use our money, what we do with our money. And I'm going to invite you to tell that story about the little boy with his candies, and he met you on the train?
Mm-hmm. Well, compassionate capitalism is something that my grandfather talked about. He felt that all of us have different talents because of our education or because of our background. You know, we're born in a family of business people. We know how to do business or something like that. So we all have a talent, and we should legitimately use that talent to create and do whatever we can do. But we should not become greedy. Today, the problem with capitalism is that it has generated so much greed. And it's that greed that has created so much grief among people. So if we can eliminate that greed and have more compassion, then business can make money, but use that money to improve and enhance the lives of the workers in that industry and the customers and the neighbors around the factories, instead of paying these CEOs and CFOs billions of dollars and the shareholders taking away the rest of the profit, and not enough being done for the community. Now, if you look back to several years ago, we used to have smaller factories and smaller businesses in neighborhoods, and their customers were living around them or in the town or something. So there was a direct relationship between the manufacturer and the consumer there. And so the manufacturers were always willing to help or keep the customers happy, and because they wanted them to buy their products. So there was that healthy relationship and transactions going on between the manufacturer as well as the customer. But then we made things big because we created the share market, and share market brought in a lot of money, for the industries, and the industries expanded, and very soon they became multinational or international businesses with such huge customer base all over the world that there was no relationship. There is still now no relationship between the manufacturer and the customers. And so that whole, you know, system has been broken. And when you have no relationship with each other, you don't care what happens to the customers and others. So, you know, that is how we have broken that the relationship and created more grief and unhappiness. So what grandfather wanted was for the business to bring back more compassion and be able to share things with them. The story that Victoria talked about was when I was a journalist and I was living in India, in Bombay, and I was coming back from work one evening and traveling by train, and I don't know if any of you have been to India, but the local trains there are always quite crowded, and you know, people hanging outside and so on. But that day I was standing in the train and reading a book, and soon I found somebody tugging at my trouser leg, and I looked down, and it was a little kid, about that high, and I don't think he was more than 5 or 6 years old. And he was dirty and rags, you know, dressed in rags. And he had a little tin can, and there was some candy in that can, and he was trying to sell that to me. And, you know, in that moment, the several thoughts came into my mind, and I thought to myself, I said, I wouldn't dare send my 5-year-old kid alone on a train like this. What is this kid doing alone without any supervision? And then I asked him, I said, my station had just come and I was getting off, so I said, can you get off with me, and I want to talk with you. So he got off and we sat there at the station and talked, and the story I heard from him was really heartbreaking. He said they were very poor. They were living in a slum in Bombay, and he had another brother who was a couple of years older than him. But every day the mother would make these candies at home and pack them up in this tin box and send the boys out to sell these candies and bring all that money home, and only then they would get something to eat. Otherwise, there was no food for them. And when I met this kid, it was about 6 o'clock in the evening. And he had more than half of that tin still to sell. And I asked him, I said, did you eat anything at all during the day? And he said, no. He didn't have anything because he didn't have any money to buy food. So he had just picked up some scraps of food from the discarded garbage, and he was surviving on that. And, you know, it really broke my heart that in the 20th century, we still have little kids who are dying of hunger and having to live this kind of subhuman life. And so that's when I thought that, you know, I need to, I did give him some money that day, but I realized that that's not going to really help, because I helped him today. I'm not going to meet him again tomorrow or the day after, and what is he going to do after that? So I decided that I need to do something more permanent, and so with some friends, we started an organization, and we've been rescuing these kids and giving them shelter and food and education. We have about 1,000 kids right now that I'm taking care of. And not all of them live with us. We do have a little dorm that we have built for kids who don't have any parents or who have a single parent not able to take care of them. So we have about 60 of them living in the dorm, but the rest of the kids still continue to live with their parents, but we provide them with their food and their clothes and education. And to that extent, the parents, are relieved of the responsibility of the kids. But that's the program we have started. It's just a drop in the ocean when you think of how many millions of children all over the world who are suffering similar, poverty and the anguish that it brings. But whatever little we can do makes a difference in the lives of people.
Responsibility again, using our money wisely is what Grandfather talked about. It's not that money is evil, it's how we use it, it's how we spend it, and how we share it. And that story has always touched me because so often we just walk by or drive by, and what is my responsibility? What is my part in changing the cycle or the circle of poverty, mistrust, and judgment? I find that often I will judge the person on the corner rather than sending my love and compassion. That's why this is my journey. I get to be learning this. So I've always been struck by how Gandhi touched so many areas about finances, about health, about society. It's so many areas. It wasn't just one thing, and that's why I think his message is still so powerful today. The other piece I really am encouraged about and love to hear about is how your parents shared what they had learned from Grandfather about being nonviolent in parenting. And so if you could share a little bit about being that teenager and getting to drive the car.
Yes, I often get this question from people, and they said, well, violence is human nature. We are born with it, and there's nothing we can do about it. And I disagree with that. And I said, violence is not human nature. If it was human nature, we wouldn't need martial arts institutes and military academies to teach us how to kill and fight. The fact that we need these academies is an indication that it's not our nature. We have to learn it. So we can also unlearn that. What is our nature is to get angry. But it's not our nature to abuse that anger. We should learn to use that anger more effectively and intelligently. And that, of course, is another story. But the reason why and the way we perpetuate violence in human society is the way we parent our children. Every time we threaten our children with punishment for misbehavior, we are planting the first seeds of violence in their minds. Then they grow up to believe that anybody who does something wrong it needs to be punished. And so that whole process of violence and the culture of violence begins from that point onwards. So in a culture of nonviolence, it is not punishment that is important, it's penance. The parents do penance instead of punishing the children. And in our family, because my parents believed in nonviolence and practiced it at home, my sisters and I, when we misbehaved, we were not punished. My parents did penance. And it depended on how serious the offense was. They would fast for a day or 2 days, and they would cook the meals and sit at the table and feed us and talk to us and tell us that they are not eating because they were not good parents and didn't teach us the right way of behavior. And because the relationships between the parents and us were based on mutual love and respect, we felt awful when that kind of thing happened. And so we made sure that we didn't do it again. And I remember the story, I was about 16 years old. I had just come back to South Africa after living with grandfather and learning all these profound lessons from him. And we were living in the Phoenix ashram, which was 18 miles outside the city of Durban. At that time, all the area around Phoenix ashram was just sugarcane plantations. Our nearest neighbors were miles away from us. And so, we didn't have any children our age to play with or have fun with. So we would look forward to going into town and visiting friends and going and seeing a movie or something. Just, teenage kind of thing. And we didn't get these opportunities very frequently because in those days, driving 18 miles to the city just to go and have fun was not a practical thing. It wasn't very expensive to drive that distance. Today we can drive 80 miles and go to have dinner or something or meet a friend without a blink of the eye. But in those days it was very difficult, and so we didn't get these opportunities frequently. And one Saturday, I remember I was, just doing nothing and wishing I could go to town and see a movie or something. And just luckily that day, my father had to go to the city to attend a conference, and he didn't feel like driving that day, and so he asked me if I would drive him into town, and I jumped at the opportunity and said yes. And since I was going into town, my mother gave me a list of groceries that she needed, and on the way into town, my father reminded me of all the little chores that had been pending for a long time, like getting the car serviced and oil change and all of that. And he said, since you have the whole day to yourself, will you please attend to these things? And I said, okay. And when I dropped him off at the conference venue, he said, at 5 o'clock in the evening, I will wait for you outside this auditorium. You come and pick me up and we'll go home together. And I said, fine. And I rushed off and I did all my chores and bought all the groceries and did everything I was expected to do. And I realized that I could still make the matinee show. And so I went to the nearest movie theater and I got so engrossed in a John Wayne double feature that I didn't realize the passage of time. The movie ended at 5:30. And I ran from there and got the car and rushed to where my dad was waiting for me. And it was almost 6, 1 hour late. And he was naturally anxious and wondering what happened to me. And so the first question he asked me is, why are you late? And instead of telling him the truth, I was so ashamed to tell him that I was watching a John Wayne double feature that I lied to him and I said the car wasn't ready. I had to wait for the car, not realizing that he had already called the garage and asked them. When he caught me in the lie, he said, there's something wrong in the way I brought you up that didn't give you the confidence to tell me the truth. that you felt you had to lie to me. And in order to find out where I went wrong, he said, I'm going to walk home 18 miles. I'm not coming with you in the car. There was absolutely nothing I could do to make him change his mind. He just started walking. It was after 6 o'clock in the evening. Much of those 18 miles were through sugarcane plantations, dirt roads, late night, no lights. I couldn't leave him and go away. So for more than 6 hours, I was crawling behind him, watching him go through that pain and agony for a stupid lie that I uttered. And I decided there and then that I was never going to lie again. And I think that was the most profound lesson in nonviolent parenting. If he had punished me the way we would punish our children today, I don't think I would have learned the lesson. I think I would have just suffered the punishment and made sure next time I don't get caught. But by taking the responsibility on himself and doing that penance, he taught me a lesson that I'll never forget. And that is the power of nonviolence.
Every story he tells to me is the next awakening and the next awakening. And it's an awakening to the willingness to change and look at our actions. Our time is flying by. To me, I could listen to him for a long moments and love to hear the stories. We have a few minutes left. We have questions. We certainly can't get to all of them, and this will have to be a brief answer. This is from Johnny Howard online. No, I apologize. This is from Suzanne Marie Chin Taylor. And she asks about what are your thoughts or suggestions on to break down barriers and fear and distrust so we can have open dialogue, productive communication, and really work together to solve problems. So the 2-minute answer. How to solve the world problems in 2 minutes.
By building better relationships between people, relationships that are based on mutual respect, understanding, acceptance, and appreciation. Today, our relationships with each other are based on selfishness. We are always trying to get something out of the other person, and if we don't get anything out of them, then why bother to have a relationship? So, it's the whole culture of violence, and we need to replace it with a culture of not violence.
So if you were speaking, I'll rephrase that, since you are speaking to this group of people and the people online, and you're speaking all over the world. He goes to Mexico next. He'll be in India this winter, and then on to Germany. He's all over the world. So we have had just this wonderful opportunity to sit and have a one-on-one conversation with Arun Gandhi. If you were to tell us one action you thought we could take that would take us individually and collectively toward a more nonviolent world, the nugget.
I think the best thing that we need to do is to look at our weaknesses and transform them into our strengths. We think that our education ends when we get a certificate from the school, and then after that we don't need to do anything. And that is why we kind of revolve around and around from birth to death, doing the same things over and over again without achieving much except making money. And that is not the whole mission in life. The mission in life is that our existence in any community should enhance that community and make it better because of our existence there. And if we do that, and if we improve ourselves by transforming those weaknesses into strengths, we become better human beings. And by becoming better human beings, we create a better world.
Thank you so much. Yay.
Thank you.
I want to thank the Spiritual Explorers Program for coming up with this idea. I want to thank Dr. Deborah Fraunfelter, who is watching us in Kansas City at Unity Village. Thank you for being a support of this program. Once again, Unity of Blue Ridge. I do want to let everyone know there will be on the Spiritual Explorers website there starting October 12th, there will be a class on nonviolent communication, which is an art. I've taken many of those classes. It's wonderful. And in 2020, I will be doing a class on the Spiritual Explorers Program online based on the book, The Gift of Anger. So once again, thank you, Arun Gandhi, for this wonderful time together.
Thank you. Thank you.